Today's podcast episode, we are talking about something that it's often mislabeled. There's so much misinformation out there and whatnot, but I want to clear the air today in today's podcast episode with what exactly is a union. What is a union? Now, before we begin into this podcast episode, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork when we start talking about what is a union. 25 years ago, we were accessing the internet via dial-up, which meant then that 25 years ago and beyond, and back 25, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, etc., the way information was processed was different. In other words, there were gatekeepers that had information that made it more difficult for you to get a hold of it. Maybe some of the older listeners here can remember having to go to a library if you had to write a report when you were in school, and you had to go to the Encyclopedia Britannica or get a book that somebody had written and reference it. It's a form of gatekeeping, and we put some trust into those individuals in the Encyclopedia Britannica and other things. But they had the information, if you will, was in a funnel. It was constrained down to a gate that you had to get through or buy some or from someone to get that information. For example, 25, 30 years ago and beyond, there was no website for OSHA from a safety perspective. So if you were working in the field, the only real way that you'd be able to find out exactly what OSHA said was that if you had somebody that you could talk to that you knew had your best interest in mind. Because oftentimes, and I don't mean this is a broad brush, and I'm not trying to broad brush every single employer here, but many employers are not going to do what they are required to do unless they're forced to do it. It's as simple as that. And so from a safety perspective, if you, the worker, do not have any access to information from an OSHA safety perspective, if you got it from a manual, you're not going to spend the money to get a manual. The employer might have it. That's a form of gatekeeping. The information is held, and it's not passed on to you who's out in the field. Now, fast forward to today, 2024, when we have an abundance of information at our fingertips. We have a device, many of us carry them around on a daily basis, that is more powerful than the computers use to land man on the moon, and we use it for entertainment purposes. But if we wanted to, we could use it for research purposes. With the click of a button, we could be at OSHA's website, and we can find out exactly what OSHA says so that you don't get tricked or fooled or lied to, etc. And that's just with OSHA. There is plenty of other informational gateways out there for just about anything really that you want to look up. Why do I bring this up? Because the propaganda, that's the word of the day, the propaganda that is used, it's still alive and well. It's just used in different forms. It can be disguised. It can be dressed up as someone's personal experience in which they're, can clearly sway other people by trying to paint something in a bad light. The propaganda could be dressed up as a quote unquote observation, whatever the case may be. It's alive and well. The way we use it has changed. In the past, we gatekept. We kept information from people intentionally. And all you had to do was take my word for it as the employer, as somebody who was anti-union or whatever, and I would tell you something and you would take my word for it because I gatekept all the information. Today, it looks different. Today, we have access to information, and so to dilute the potency of true information, the propagandas, instead of gatekeeping, what is done instead is we flood the information, and we put out misinformation and disinformation. Now, this happens in it doesn't matter if it's politics, It doesn't matter if it's it doesn't matter what industry or what you're talking about. This is true in every single topic that you're going to want to talk about today or look up. It's the playbook. And it's no different in today's topic when we say, what is a union? You will find enormous amounts of information that are attempting to dissuade you, and they're attempting to flood the informational gateways with misinformation and disinformation so that you're overwhelmed, if you will. You're overwhelmed with the enormous amount of information that's out there and trying to figure out what is true and what's not, especially if this is not your normal forte. You're not researching all the time. You're not looking for things. You don't know if a specific individual or a website or etc. have, what are they highlighting? Who are they referencing? What are they talking about? Where do they get their data from? It can feel inundating. It can feel overwhelming. I understand. I spend an enormous amount of time doing research instead of watching football games or any of the other hobbies that a lot of people have. This podcast and the website that it is an extension of is my hobby. It's what I do. It's what I look at. Coincidentally, I'm also a union member, so I can offer up the information that I'm going to on this podcast episode that's piggybacking off of the article already written about what a union is. And I want to make sure that we're clear on this when it comes to effectively, if I could be so bold as to say, it has a lot of what I would say influence over your entire life. And for reasons that we'll kind of get into. But the definition is far, far simpler than what most people readily understand. And so with that groundwork laid, let's now look at some of what I've used on the website article to really drive home the point about unions, to make it as simple as possible for everybody to understand. All right. So got my notes here, and here we go. So first off, I'm going to use two different online dictionaries. And again, I'll link descriptions. I'll link hyperlinks in the notes of this podcast episode. But I use two online definitions to really drive home the point. Okay. The first one is from Merriam-Webster, and it is, quote, for the word union, quote, something that is made one, something formed by a combining or coalition of parts or members, end quote. Now that's Merriam-Webster's. Seems pretty self-explanatory. Let's go to dictionary.com. Quote, the act of uniting two or more things, and the state of being united, end quote. So the first one is, to reiterate, something that is made one, something formed by a combining or coalition of parts or members. And then the second definition, the act of uniting two or more things, the state of being united. This is going to work well, and this will serve us in this podcast episode of What is a Union? So, what are some examples then of unions? I'm glad you asked. The first one I use on the article, which I think is going to be pretty self-explanatory when we begin this process, when two people elect to come together in marriage, they're a union. Two people have come together. They've decided to become married, one flesh, however you want to explain it. This is, for all intents and purposes, a union. You've heard it said before. It's a union. That's what I assert on this podcast episode here. So as we build up our examples of what a union is, we're weaving a narrative that the definition of what a union actually is relatively simple. So that's example number one from what a union is. Another great example that we routinely we just missed the mark. For whatever reason, we don't even think about it. The United States. The very existence of this country in general is a collection of states that have come together to form the Union. It's what we say. As a matter of fact, when the president stands up once a year in Congress and he gives the State of the Union address. We hear the word so much in this context that we just completely ignore it a lot of times when we consider what a union is. And I promise you, we're going to get into what I'm really wanting to get into, which is what labor unions are down the line. But I need to lay this out because it makes perfect sense. It is a collection. As a matter of fact, in the preamble of the Constitution, what does it say? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. They're telling you right out of the gate. So the collection, and in Latin, it's called e pluribus unum, or out of the many, one. We are coming together. So the United States, then, all the individual states, in our case today, it's 50 states are coming together for the collective good. So what Alaska may not be able to achieve, or is not going to be able to achieve on its own, or what Texas is not going to be able to achieve on its own, or what Illinois, or what Montana, or what New Mexico, or what Florida, you see where I'm going with this, any of these individual states are not going to be able to achieve on their own. We come together to collectively achieve something. And in this case, a more prosperous economy. And as it so happens, what has taken place? We have become the driving economy in the world. And this model has worked so well of states coming together to form a union that Europe followed suit. And you had a collection of countries that are closely resembling states, if you will, over here in the United States. And those countries decided, oh, let's come together and form the European Union, which last I checked, I think they represent about 400 plus million individuals, population-wise. They saw what happened with the United States and how well it has served America, and they said, let's come together to do the same thing. And it's worked well for them. That is, and I might add also over here stateside, we say these things over and over again. United we stand, divided we fall. We use this, we say this over and over again, and we'll use it from a citizenry. I'm a very proud citizen. We'll use it from a citizenry perspective, a very patriotic perspective. United we stand, divided we fall. Yes, that's absolutely true. And that's because depending on who you look at or who you reference, the 320 to 350 million Americans in this country realize, even if it's even if it's in the back of their minds or subconsciously, they realize that collectively we have come together then for the good of everyone. This makes perfect sense. So now, once we see these examples, we looked at marriage, and we looked at the United States that have come together to form the collective, as well as the European Union that did the same thing. Now we get into labor unions. And you know what they are at their most basic definition. Now, I want to make sure I'm crystal clear. At their most basic definition, labor unions are a collection of people, and I'll say iron workers or pipe fitters or electricians, for example, who have come together for the collective good, so that what one person is unable to accomplish, and I'm not talking about work, I'm talking about increase in wages, increase in job site benefits, increase in job site conditions. All of these things is one person going to be able to make as great of an impact as the collective. It's not likely to be the case. In fact, I would sit here and tell you today that collective good that has come together, what they have ultimately been able to accomplish over the past 100, roughly 20 years, depending on when each one of these labor unions got started, they have been able to achieve significant concessions. It is the collective good of unions. I'm going to reinforce this definition continually. It is just a collection of people who have come together. That collection of people, they're the ones who came together and said, we're tired of our kids not being able to even just be kids and having to work in dirty dangerous conditions and not even have a childhood. So we've pushed and pushed. A collective group of people again came and pushed and said, we don't want our kids working. And it's what we got to ban on child labor. It's also what pushed and said, I already work. Today we take for granted the 8-hour workday. I already work a third of my entire life. I'm not saying that work is not productive, nor is it good. I'm saying that there needs to be a balance. And the collective, again, unions, the collection of people came together and said, we actually want to be able to spend time with our kids and watch them grow up and do things with them and not have them work and have discretionary spending or extra money left over to be able to do some things with them. And we want to be able to divide the 24-hour workday up into 8 hours of sleeping, 8 hours of family time, and 8 hours of work. And it's what pushed that into it. And so we actually want a weekend to spend time with people, loved ones, and not work away your entire life. Work is good, but we were never meant to work continually all the time. And the collective good of people that came together said, no more. We're going to push for this. We don't want this. We don't want to work all the time over and over and over again. They're also the same ones that have pushed every single time, the collection of people again, for safety and job site issues. OSHA. And back in 1970, when 38 people on average died every single day, and right now we're hovering, depending on what year you look at, it might be 12 to 15. And in 1970, we had roughly, I'll say it's around 100 million people in the workforce. Today, it's over 200 million. So we've doubled the number of people in the workforce, while we have reduced the number of deaths by at least 2/3. We've made significant progress. Now, we're not there, but the point remains. Every single advancement, whether it's in wages, whether it's in benefits, whether it's in job site safety, whether it's codified in law, and we'll get into that in a second, has come because the collective good of people came together and said, we want better. That's what we want. And that, at its most basic and pure definition, is what a union actually is. And I've already addressed this in common misconceptions and talking points, but a union is very democratically structured as well, far more than a corporation or a company, because the business manager who runs the day-to-day operations of the union not only works for the members, but he's also elected by the members. And the various other committees that make up the day-to-day operations, or trustees, or what have you, those individuals are also elected in there. It's a very democratic organization. So again, when we look at a labor union and we go, what is a union in general? Because it's mystifying, especially if you don't know. And then you go on the internet, because we've got a very powerful computer in our hands, and we actually decide, okay, well, I'm going to use this device not for entertainment purposes, but for educational ones. I legitimately want to know, and I don't have anybody that I can ask. I find all kinds of information out there that just feels like it's very intimidating, it's overwhelming, etc. And that's certainly the case for a lot of people. Well, today you have an article on my website as well as a podcast where I'm telling you its most basic definition. And now I'm going to end this podcast episode with a couple different points that are going to take a few minutes to expand upon, but they're worth my time doing it, and they're worth your time listening. And you'll come to understand why when I expound on these. Number one, there is a common misconception. I have not addressed it yet, at least as of the recording for this podcast episode, but I will. But I'll also touch on it today. There is a common misconception, a common talking point from people, and it feels very disingenuous, because it's when someone says, yes, unions were important in the past, but they're not important today. That's propaganda dressed up as a compliment, but it's not true. And we're going to get into this, because they'll say, yes, Unions were needed. We needed unions for the 8-hour workday. We needed unions for safety. We needed unions for no child labor, all this other stuff. But today we've got governmental law and we got practice going in, and we don't need unions today. We have the court system. Yeah. Let me tell you what's taking place today, right now in the court system, and why even governmental law and the way that the government currently is structured and looking to enforce certain things, it's not even safe. Number one, the FTC's ban on non-competes. Now, I've touched on this in what is a collective bargaining agreement in the website, as on the article side, as well as in the podcast episode. But a non-compete is essentially a contract that you sign with somebody saying, I won't go to work for anybody else. They're locking you in is effectively what you're doing. And if you're under a collective bargaining agreement, which is what unions, remember, a group of people who come together and they have a contract that says, all right, employers, you're going to pay me this. These are my job site hours. These are my conditions, etc. All of this is coming together if you have that collective bargaining agreement. But if you don't, and the FTC estimates, I believe it was 30 million Americans are covered or trapped, if you will, for lack of a better word, for the probable use of the word trapped by a non-competes. The FTC is being sued by the Chamber of Commerce to eradicate that ban on non-competes. The FTC just says, okay, if you're in a policy-making decision, meaning you're a VP, you're making, I think the threshold is $151,000, at least $151,000, and you're in a policy-making position that the non-compete is binding, or you're selling your business, for example, to somebody else. But if you're just an average worker, so the FTC is being sued by the Chamber of Commerce and to stop it. Number two, the Department of Labor is also being sued in their raising of the salary threshold. It was in the mid 30s, and by, I believe, January of next year, I think the amount of money was, I think it was at $58,000 roughly. So what that means then is the Department of Labor is ultimately raising the threshold, meaning if you make less than, in our case today, by the time it gets to January 1st, if you make $56,000 instead of $58,000, you are eligible for overtime. And companies, they're suing the Department of Labor, and the main reason why is because they want to pay people, quite frankly, as low as possible and exploit people, because that's really what happens when you're on salary in a lot of ways. I've been on salary a couple different times, and I've only had one positive experience in it. The previous one that I had, it was a crapshoot, and you're almost always exploited. You almost always work more hours. Well, with the Department of Labor and the way that they structured this was, okay, if you're going to make more money, we're raising this threshold so that you're eligible then for overtime. And they're being sued for it. Here recently, the Chevron doctrine, which in its most simple terms, I'll read it directly from a website, was, quote, is an administrative law principle that compelled federal courts to defer to a federal agency's interpretation of an ambiguous or unclear statute that Congress delegated to the agency to administer. So in other words, if it's ambiguous, the actual agency, which has boots on the ground, eyes on something, whether it's regulating commercial fishing, which is exactly where the Chevron doctrine was overturned from the Supreme Court perspective, or whether it's in oil and gas, safety, MSHA, OSHA, all of these various agencies, Department of Labor, all of these various agencies, now it's very ambiguous about what they can do in a lot of ways. We have yet to see how this is going to play out, but we'll see, I'm sure, in the coming years. And lastly, what I would highlight from this perspective is SpaceX. I think it's Trader Joe's as well as Amazon. There might be somebody else who's joined on this bandwagon, but they're trying to basically say the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, is unconstitutional in the way that administrative law judges are protected, if you will. And it's already been, at least in the Texas side of the House, where one of the cases was brought, they put a moratorium, they put a halt on what was taking place with the NLRB. So now you don't even really know what the actual agency that governs our laws from a labor perspective, what they can do. Now it's going to wind its way through. And so now it's unclear. The reason I bring all this up is not actually to talk about these individual things. The point that I'm making is that these things which deal with workers have each and every single one has been attacked by business, by people who have an interest, if you will, in seeing that people don't come together and collectively, right? Remember, that's the definition of a union. It's people coming together. You can't, it's not even governmental law at this point is not, even governmental law that's been codified for decades is not safe. So in reality then, because that's the case, I'll leave you with a quote from Tom Donahue. The only effective answer to organized greed is organized labor. Unions aren't needed today. No, they are needed more today than they ever have been, because the slippery slope that is taking place, that is unfolding, if you will, in front of a lot of people's eyes when it comes to governing labor and promoting worker welfare, is actually under attack. And the second point that I want to bring out here is that a rising tide lifts all boats. It was one of the more famous sayings that John F. Kennedy is credited with saying, but a rising tide lifts all boats. Just by the existence of a union in general, the non-union workers benefit. Case in point, it's an article as well as a podcast episode of the positive ripple effects of the UAW. Almost, and you have to go and check you can check the veracity of the statements that I'm making right now, because on the article, there are hyperlinks where I found every single bit of this information. But almost every single automaker, the only one that I was unable to find any information on, I think, was Tesla. Almost every single automaker, when the UAW announced that they had won concessions for their members, and some of them, before they had even announced they had made concessions, almost every single one of those Southern automakers that are non-union increased their wages from a range from 7% to 9% to 11%. Hyundai said, we're going to raise wages for our non-union automaker workers in the factories 25% over a 4-year period. Tell me that those workers did not benefit just by the existence of the UAW. They certainly did. And the icing on the cake here is that all of those Southern automakers, the ones that are based in Japan, the ones that are based in South Korea, the ones that are based in Europe, they're all union in their home country. They're non-union here. And one of the reasons, there's multiple reasons, but one of the reasons here is because the propaganda about what a union actually is has been so effective, when in reality, like I said, it is a collection of people who have come together for the collective good. That's exactly it. So a rising tide lifts all boats, and non-union workers benefit. They don't benefit to the same degree that union workers do, because they haven't come with the collective, which is exactly what union workers want. We want to represent you as well. So you don't get the exact same benefits, but they get the spillover, if you will. The rising tide lifts all boats. And lastly, I would like to highlight something that a lot of people probably don't even think about. Given that the definition that I have used is a collection of people to come together, and you intuitively know this to be true, I've already mentioned what some of the examples are to really kind of drive home the definition. But because I've used that definition intentionally to really talk about what it is, you might be surprised to discover that in many ways, non-union companies form quasi-unions and pay dues for their associations. That's what that's a union in the definition in terms that I'm talking about. And so these non-union employers, whether it's at a corporation level, primarily, you're right, when we think about it, primarily in the Southern United States, or whether it's just a non-union employer in general that belongs to an association, well, I'm going to pay dues. Well, guess what? I have paid dues. I have these non-union companies who do not want you to join a union or you to be represented are in fact represented and are in fact in quasi-unions. Case in point, many of them that belong to these quasi-unions, they also have somebody that they pay to represent them. The term lobbyist, where someone goes to, whether it's at the state level or at the federal level, and they go in there and they're basically representing those people's interests. In this simple definition of what I have used to discuss a union as a collection of people, we would say, from a trade union perspective, that the business manager is paid by the members through the dues that they pay to represent their workers. Non-union companies are very good at double talk when they join associations that function really similar to today's trade unions. They just don't want you, the worker, being represented. And so there we have, and I'll put a nice little wrap on this podcast episode. What is a union? It's very simple and it's really clear. It's a collection of people that have come together for the collective good. Thanks for tuning in to this podcast episode. I appreciate your time. I'll see you on the next one.